The second study in this area also involves Canadian speakers moving somewhere else. This is work that Jen Neitsch did on Canadian English speakers who were living in the New York City region. She was a PhD student at NYU when she was doing this work. These were speakers who moved there after the age of 21. She looked at the contrast between cot and cot, which Canadian English speakers don't have and New York speakers do, and the raising of ow before voiceless consonants. This is something that Canadian English speakers will do, but New York speakers will not do. She describes her methodology as follows, that each speaker participated in a conversation about growing up in Canada, moving to the US, and living there as an expatriate. They talked about aspects of Canadian speech versus local American speech, and other topics around being a Canadian in a new country. She says that the interview context was essentially a 90-minute activation of Canadian identity and presumably Canadian labeled exemplars. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of this study, and there was another one that was quite surprising too, is that she found a statistically significant effect for word class in the production of back vowels. So by word class, we mean the two classes of words, the words that would be pronounced as the cot words, with the all, probably quite exaggerated in the way I did it just there, and then the cot words where it has a cot vowel. Again, we have an F1, F2 plot. This is a normalized F1, F2 plot where we're not seeing hertz directly, but it's been normalized for the vowel space of the individual speakers, so we can put a bunch of speakers on one plot, and we see that there's a pretty clear separation of these vowels from those. The effect is described in absolute terms as being small, and it may well not be perceptible under a lot of conditions. So if you just heard one of these speakers saying cot, you might not be able to label it as one or the other, even if you are a person who has that contrast in general. The effect was stronger on higher frequency words. So why is that it might be stronger for higher frequency words? Well, presumably it means that they had more opportunities to learn the pronunciation of those higher frequency words. But also this has an interesting theoretical implication that you're not just learning the categories themselves, but you're learning the pronunciations of the individual words, which I guess is in some ways maybe kind of straightforward. On raising, she did find that Canadian speakers did raise still a fair bit, although there were 8 of them that only raised in the words about and out. Raising is more persistent in the frequent words, which leads to a kind of a paradox. Why is it, if the Canadians are learning not to raise from the New Yorkers, why does the degree of loss of raising correlate negatively with frequent words? Her suggestion in the paper is that raising is being used as a marker of identity, and so that in the frequent words, perhaps people are more aware. And out and about, that is a pair for which, Canadians are famous for raising, and maybe so they're aware of this way in which they're famous for it. Another puzzling feature of the study is that the degree of raising and the degree of contrast were positively correlated. That is, the speakers in general, the speakers who had more raising also had more of the new American contrast. So in one way they're more Canadian, one way they're more American. She suggests that the speakers were more linguistically sensitive. In more recent work, Neitsch has examined style shifting in her corpus. You might remember the Oprah study that we just talked about recently. So she looked at different contexts in the interviews, so whether the speakers were talking about Canada or whether they were talking positively about Canada or the United States. And what she found is that they didn't produce higher, that is higher in terms of tongue position, diphthongs before ta, when they were speaking about Canada than the United States. But she did find that when they were speaking positively about Canada, she get more diphthongization. And she also found that when they were talking about New York in a particularly positive way, she would get awe that was more, that was higher to higher tongue position as well. So again, positive attitudes about the places would yield greater use of these features, which are indexical in one way or another with that place. And again, she points out that there were in this paper, she talks about 3 speakers in particular who show the greatest low back vowel difference, right? So they're making the biggest distinction. They got more of this new contrast, that they're also the ones who show the greatest amount of Canadian raising. So before we wrap up, this work is interesting. I think one way which is interesting is the fact that it uses careful phonetic study of the vowel contrast, because if one just transcribed the two, you might not always hear the difference. And so that's perhaps one flaw with the Chambers paper that we looked at before.